Welcome to the Deep Dives. Today we're taking, an uncompromising look at a place where political reality isn't some distant policy debate. It's the intimate air you breathe every single day.
Yeah, absolutely.
Our entire focus today comes from just one source, but it's a profoundly moving one, a deeply personal memoir. It charts this intense, really painful journey life in Kashmir, shifting from a sweet, almost idyllic childhood
Right.
straight into an existence just consumed by armed conflict, by a constant, pervasive state of fear.
And that intimate single perspective is so critical here, isn't it? We're deliberately trying to move past the usual sort of abstract geopolitics.
Exactly.
Our goal is to synthesize the author's own memories, tracking that rapid, honestly terrifying escalation of violence that hit Kashmir in the late 80s and early 90s. And I think most importantly, we're charting the profound, the really enduring impact this sudden militarization had on everyday life, on culture, the bedrock of family structures, and of course, individual identity.
We want to give you, the listener, a kind of shortcut to understanding this immense human tragedy. This isn't just like reading a history book, right?
No, not at all.
It's a study in how an entire society is forced to cope, or maybe ultimately collapses, when this deep-seated political violence becomes the defining, inescapable feature of just existing.
Yeah.
We'll focus specifically on those small, human details that make the abstract idea of war terrifyingly concrete. Things like the names of torture centers, the actual price of a critical permit, even, believe it or not, the surprising fashion trends started by militants.
It's really a deep dive into those moments just before the storm hit, and how those cherished, beautiful memories of peace, they serve as this crushing contrast to the horror that unfolded later.
Right.
So we really need to start by understanding the texture of that piece so we can fully appreciate everything that was lost.
Okay, so let's unpack this opening part and really settle into that idyllic starting point.
Yeah.
The memoir places us squarely in a mountain village.
Yeah.
It's in the Anantnag district, southern Kashmir, and it paints a world that's just utterly defined by sensory detail, the rhythm of nature, and this really tight-knit community life.
And we're given this immediate, really powerful contrast between the seasons. The author recalls winter. The sheer weight of the snow, the sound of it sliding off the roof with this huge thud.
Wow.
And then the need to build snowmen using bits of charcoal for eyes. It paints this picture of intense cold, sure, but also immense kind of isolated beauty.
And what really brings that memory alive for me is the detail about childhood ingenuity.
Oh, yeah.
The source describes stealing this forbidden mix, milk and sugar, and mixing it with homemade icicles, eating it like a secret improvised ice cream.
Right. It shows a world where, the biggest risk was getting told off, maybe a slap from a parent. Certainly not the danger of a military raid or a stray bullet.
A completely different scale of risk.
Exactly. It's a world where curiosity and these small acts of defiance, that's what define danger. In social life, it revolved around these seasonal rhythms and, the simple need for warmth. We see the men gathering at shop fronts doing that essential ritual of warming themselves with kangris.
Those mobile fire pots, right?
Exactly, those traditional woven pots they carry inside their clothes during the freezing months. And their conversations were slow, specific gossiping about politics sometimes, but more often, how the last snowfall would affect the vital spring mustard crop.
And when spring finally came, the whole narrative shifts. The mountains turn this vivid green, the fields just explode into yellow mustard flowers. It suggests a land that's naturally abundant, life where the main concerns are, climate, family, tradition.
And the home scene, the domestic life, served as this stable, multi-generational nucleus, didn't it?
Yep.
Before the conflict, anyway. Dinner was this formal, precise ritual.
Right.
The grandfather, who we learned was just a pivotal figure, he was the center, always leaning against his special cushion, that cushion sort of signaling his seniority, maybe joking quietly with the grandmother.
And the grandmother, she's described as someone puffing gently on her hookah before she sort of ambles off to supervise the cooking.
Yeah.
And we get these wonderful, specific portraits of the younger generation thriving under this roof. There was Aunt Taslima, the definite geek, right? Always buried in thick chemistry or zoology books, completely focused on her studies.
And then there's the rebel, Aunt Rabina. The source paints her perfectly. She had this keen interest in women's magazines and detective fiction stuff the grandfather would have definitely called frivolous, maybe even un-Islamic.
Oh, for sure.
She kept Bollywood songs playing really low on her transistor radio, always ready to snap it off if she heard someone coming upstairs, especially the grandfather.
Yeah.
These small acts of defiance, they highlight that internal cultural tension that existed even in peacetime, you know?
That's a great point. Now, despite this picturesque setting and the, surface beauty, there was this deeply entrenched, maybe somewhat rigid ideological structure governing the household, mostly driven by the grandfather. What was the core of his teaching?
Well, his core identity was really tied to severe discipline and teaching, based on a specific idea of religious purity. He was the family's moral compass, forbidding anything he saw as un-Islamic, especially popular music. He was convinced it led to bad grades and, worse, a weakening of faith. His focus was entirely on developing moral fortitude and intellectual rigor.
The source mentions he favored this ideal of the Superman-like Muslim youth, right? A concept from the poet Muhammad Iqbal.
That's right. It emphasized strength, self-reliance, rigorous education, a far cry from the pop culture the younger generation was starting to crave.
And this framework wasn't just theoretical. It was kind of the engine driving the father's success.
Absolutely. The father himself had this classic, inspiring story. An orphan, taken in and mentored by the grandfather, rose through sheer hard work to become a magistrate in the Kashmir civil service. That path education leading to authority, that was the established route.
And he tried to instill that same huge ambition in the author, didn't he? Specifically preparing him for the incredibly competitive Indian civil service exam, the toughest hurdle in the country. To inspire him, the father shared classics like Shakespeare, promoted Abraham Lincoln as a hero who overcame hardship reading by streetlight. But the contradiction here feels immense. Striving for top positions within the Indian state bureaucracy while still keeping this cultural distance from it.
That distance, as you say, is the critical nuance here. The author states it explicitly. Despite his father's professional ties to the Indian state, the family felt this profound lack of connection to Indian nationalism itself. The symbols were just meaningless to them. The flag, the anthem, and crucially, the national cricket team.
Ah, the cricket metaphor.
Yep.
It's truly excellent because it translates what could be dry political alienation into something shared, immediate, high stakes emotionally. They universally supported Pakistan against India. If Pakistan wasn't playing, they'd support the West Indies or England, anyone but India.
Yeah.
It was this tangible way for the community to express dissent without saying a word about politics.
And the source gives us that really memorable, tense story about the 1987 India-Pakistan finals in the UAE. The whole community huddled around the radio, the tension so thick, listening to every syllable. And the grandmother, she took the stakes so seriously, she sat facing Mecca on her prayer mat, actually praying for Pakistan to win.
Wow.
That anecdote just perfectly illustrates how strong that emotional, even spiritual distance from the Indian state already was, even before the guns arrived, and changed absolutely everything.
It's fascinating, isn't it? The foundation of the father's life, ambition, law, education depended directly on the Indian system, but the cultural and emotional loyalty of the rest of the family lay completely outside it. That internal conflict really sets the stage for the collapse that follows.
And that quiet, powerful, emotional distance, it just quickly metastasized into absolute trauma in January 1990. The beginning of the end of this idyllic world wasn't gradual at all. It was immediate, brutally violent, and it centered on the Gokadal massacre on January 21st.
Gokadal. This event marks the first major mass killing in the valley. Protesters marching towards a Sufi shrine in Srinagar crossed the Gokadal Bridge. And in response, the Central Reserve Police Force, the CRPF, one of those key Indian paramilitary units, they just opened fire without warning. Over 50 people killed.
The impact on society was instantaneous, chilling. It spread panic like wildfire. And the massacre happened worryingly close to the father's office, which initially fueled fear for his safety.
Right.
But quickly that fear solidified into collective shock and just overwhelming anger. Shops closed down immediately, public buses stopped, all daily commerce just ground to a halt.
And out of that collective trauma, that singular rallying cry was born. Hum kai chate azadi.
What do we want? Freedom!
Exactly. That phrase started echoing everywhere. By February 1990, Kashmir wasn't just politically discontent anymore. It was in the grip of a full-blown, violent rebellion.
And with that, the ordinary, everyday language of the village just militarized overnight. Residents, including the young author, had to quickly learn a whole new, chilling set of acronyms and phrases.
Yeah, terms like JKLF, Jammu and Kashmir Liberation Front and JKSLF, representing the new militant groups, were instantly contrasted with the state security forces. The BSF, Border Security Force, and the CRPF you mentioned. We should pause on these acronyms. The local population instantly got the functional difference, didn't they?
Absolutely.
JKLF, JKSLF, they symbolized immediate, aggressive resistance, the promise of a future state, while BSF and CRPF represented the overwhelming, often brutal state response.
And phrases like frisking, crackdown, interrogation, they weren't abstract policy terms anymore. They were routine facts of life, defining when you left the house whether you'd make it home safely.
When reality gets too painful, culture often steps in to provide heroes, propaganda.
Yes, exactly. In Kashmir, that came partly in the form of a fictional hero. The author describes this slim paperback thriller arriving, featuring a protagonist named Ali. He was like James Bond and Rambo rolled into one, supposedly single-handedly destroying hundreds of Russian tanks, rescuing his father. It was escapist, fantastical, and probably deeply needed at the time.
But the real ideological inspiration, the cinematic one, was Mustafa Akkad's 1981 film Lion of the Desert.
Ah, yes. That was the true myth maker. The film tells the story of Omar Mukhtar, the aging Bedouin leader fighting the Italian occupation in Libya.
Right.
Men gathered at shop fronts, not for warmth anymore, but to hear the story narrated passionately. Mukhtar refusing to surrender to Mussolini's general, telling him with dignity that they had no right to occupy another nation. That narrative gave immediate, powerful, historical shape to the local defiance.
The militarization became profoundly visible, too, even in quiet villages. Soldiers in olive or khaki uniforms, helmets, constantly passing through in long files, carrying those terrifying cylindrical mortar guns.
Yeah, and the very sight of those weapons fueled disturbing rumors, like the story of a town near the border deliberately burned by Indian troops, allegedly throwing gunpowder on houses and then firing mortars to raze them completely. Fact and rumor just blended seamlessly, all serving to heighten the terror.
And the war didn't spare the schools either. It arrived right at the schoolhouse door. And this is where the first big physical and demographic rupture happened. The devastating vanishing of the Pandits.
By March 1990, the source notes, 5 Kashmiri Pandit classmates were just gone, missing. They'd fled the valley because of rapidly escalating fear, a fear stemming not just from the military crackdown, but also from militant attacks, specifically targeting pro-India Muslims in the Pandits, who were often seen as aligned with the Indian state.
The deaths had thoroughly scared the Pandit community. Tens of thousands left for Jammu, Delhi, other cities. This evacuation was instantly visible in the half-empty classrooms, the sudden, irreversible change in the neighborhood's social fabric. That multi-ethnic harmony, which had been taken for granted, was just severed.
And for the boys who stayed, growing up in this vacuum, the militancy took on this strange, compelling glamour, didn't it?
Yeah, it did. Schoolboys started drawing detailed Kashmir maps on their notebooks, painting slogans like "War till Victory" on school walls. They traded stories about militant style, their hair, their fashion choices.
This militant chic, as you called it, quickly defined the new high fashion. The Russian Kamachi shoes became the height of cool, a symbol of ruggedness, rebellion.
Right.
Boys even replaced the stones in their rings with pistol bullets they found or traded, a terrifying sign of violence becoming normalized.
It really is.
And the most captivating object, the one that achieved mythical status, was the Kalashnikov, rumored to have powers greater than Aladdin's lamp. Even strict disciplinarian teachers, the kind who once enforced the grandfather's codes, would now shake hands deferentially with a passing militant.
It's incredible.
What's crucial here is how that initial idealistic fight for Azadi quickly got tangled up with style, status, the intoxicating feeling of being part of something powerful, dangerous. It shifted the focus from the intellectual resistance the father preached to the immediate visceral appeal of the gun.
So as the author is maturing in this environment, his youthful enthusiasm for those militant slogans, that militant chic, it quickly brings him into direct conflict with his family, especially his father, who'd staked his entire life on achieving stability through the very system the militants wanted to destroy.
Right. The father, having secured his position as a respected magistrate through incredible personal sacrifice, he launches this powerful counter-argument against the path of violence. He emphasizes that successful rebellions are fundamentally long affairs, led by educated men.
He points to history, right?
Yeah.
Nehru and Gandhi studying law, Václav Havel the writer, the Dalai Lama defined by wisdom, not weapons.
Exactly. His message was a plea for strategic, intellectual, long-term thinking. If you genuinely want to change Kashmir, You have to read, study, write. Don't just pick up a gun, which guarantees a short life and, frankly, a dead end. He saw that violence, in this specific context, was self-defeating for a vulnerable population.
The father's arguments were powerful, verbally, but the mother's appeal, that was even more immediate, deeply dramatic.
Oh, yes. The source describes the author getting ready to leave for school, still kind of flirting with the idea of joining the movement, and his mother, without saying a single word about it, performs this profound silent act.
Oh, she takes off her headscarf.
Yes, takes off her headscarf and lays it at his feet, pleading desperately for him not to try joining the armed movement again.
The power of that gesture, a mother sacrificing her personal religious custom, her dignity, in a public plea to save her son, it stopped him instantly.
It must have.
It showed him the real cost of his choices wasn't just his own life, but the complete unraveling of his family's moral and social order.
But choosing to stay out meant watching others go. And the family's closeness to the conflict was just unrelenting, defined by this agonizing uncertainty. This comes through so powerfully in the story of Tariq, the author's cousin.
The sportsman.
The sportsman, exactly, who left for arms training across the line of control, the Law Sea, that heavily militarized border separating Indian and Pakistani-administered Kashmir.
Tariq's absence forced the family into this agonizing ritual, listening to the Pakistan-controlled radio show. Not for entertainment, but because it was the only way to get confirmation of life.
Imagine that. Hearing a cryptic message, maybe a song request dedicated by someone like Amit Kumar from Lajpat Nagar, and that was the coded signal that their sons were still alive across the border. The daily terror tied to just tuning in a radio program.
Hoping for that coded reassurance, it's chilling.
And when Tariq briefly returned, he was immediately seen as this modern-day hero, a Marco Polo bringing tidings of a new world from across the forbidden border. He proudly showed off his bullet-torn trousers like a war trophy.
But his eventual death, which felt almost inevitable, completely broke his father, Raman Uncle, a retired police officer who'd spent his life enforcing the law.
Raman Uncle, the man who'd mentored the author's own father, just sat there, absolutely broken, chain-smoking his hookah, crying that Tariq had crossed the border given his life, without even telling me. The war wasn't just destroying stability, it was destroying that fundamental parental authority the control parents had over their children's destiny.
And the danger wasn't just confined to militants and their families, was it? It became an everyday reality for any professional just trying to live a normal life.
Absolutely. The father's previously routine 2-hour journey from Srinagar started taking 5 hours routinely just because of all the military checkpoints. Passengers forced into long queues, hands raised, holding ID cards, prolonged body searches. Life just became a series of military formalities.
Which leads us to that terrifying personal story involving the father, the assassination attempt. This incident feels so critical because it reveals the messy, localized motives that often fueled the violence, completely separate from the grand ideological narratives.
Yeah, the father, a civil servant, was targeted, but not by some separatist commander aiming for Azadi.
Yeah.
No, it was by a man the author calls Iago, a local figure seeking personal revenge because the father had denied a bureaucratic permit to a rival simply on legal grounds.
Just doing his job.
Just doing his job. And this Iago character, cynically flirting with pro-India groups by day, supported anti-India militants by night. He managed to convince a Hizbul Mujahideen commander that the father was dangerous simply for trying to ensure smooth village elections, which the militants wanted to boycott.
So a landmine was planted, motivated entirely by local political ambition and personal vendetta.
Unbelievable. And the father's car was saved purely by chance by a random piece of infrastructure. The landmine's blast got blocked by a drainage pipe on one end, directing the force away from the car. The author notes with this terrifying dark humor, "Physics had saved my family."
Physics.
That near-death experience, triggered by petty corruption and local rivalries, forced the family to transfer the father to a new, supposedly calmer capital, further restricting their movement, their contact with their village relatives. Just another layer of isolation. The most systematic and maybe the most long-lasting consequence of the conflict was the creation of this infrastructure of fear, a deliberate system of control, humiliation, destruction that just permeated every aspect of civic life.
Yeah.
And this was experienced most directly through the relentless cycle of curfews and crackdowns.
The source material here is just profoundly shocking. Troops set up permanent camps in major civic buildings, specifically targeting schools and colleges. They occupied buildings like the State High School in Aishmukam.
Mm.
Students forced to walk past military trucks returning with arrested men tied with ropes. And here's the detail that just sticks with you. At night, students trying to sleep in their dorms would hear the agonizing cries of prisoners being tortured in the rooms right next to theirs.
School became a torture annex. Literally.
It's unbelievable. Even the simple act of going to school became dangerous. The author's younger brother, Wajahat, recounts this traumatic experience of running in pure terror from an army battle tank that just suddenly appeared in the market near his school.
Good grief.
The tank commander shouted at him, "Run, or do you want to die?" This kind of interaction normalized and amplified the terror for an entire generation of kids.
And the humiliation extended to the entire male community during these routine crackdowns. You have to picture the scene. Men, regardless of status, profession, age, forced to queue up in public spaces like hospital lawns, standing with their hands raised, showing ID cards, made to walk slowly past the masked mukbir, the local Kashmiri collaborator, who stood waiting to identify militants or sympathizers.
That visual is immensely powerful, isn't it?
Yeah.
Every man reduced to this uniform position of submission, totally at the mercy of a masked anonymous informer.
It was designed to sow total distrust within the community itself, making sure everyone suspected everyone else of being either a collaborator or a target.
But far worse than the crackdowns were the interrogation and torture centers. The source names the most infamous, Papa 2.
Papa 2, formerly the Fairview Guest House on Gavkar Road. It had this chilling history once the palace of Hari Singh, the Maharaja who signed the instrument of accession,
Right.
converted into a notorious detention center where, according to the source, hundreds did not return. The name change itself just symbolizes that complete inversion of authority and peace.
Survivors like Shafi and Ansar recounted horrific, precise details of what they endured there. The physical brutality was extreme, using a heavy concrete roller deliberately rolled over legs to crush them, burning with cigarettes, constant agonizing beatings with fists, feet, batons, guns. The intent was maximum pain, permanent damage.
And that was coupled with systematic psychological warfare. Detainees forced to recite Jai Hind Victory to India morning and evening. Refusal meant immediate, brutal beating. It wasn't just patriotism, it was forcing the vanquished to acknowledge the victory of their tormentors.
The most barbaric technique described, which speaks to the absolute dehumanization intended, was being tied naked to a long wooden ladder and then repeatedly dunked into a ditch filled with this noxious mix of kerosene oil and red chili powder.
Oh, God.
This level of focused chemical and physical assault, it sounds like it was often designed not just for immediate intelligence, but for the complete destruction of the person.
Ansar specifically noted these attacks focused intensely on their masculinity, their dignity. It left many survivors with lifelong medical issues like impotence, profound psychological damage, inability to work. Shafi, for instance, needed corrective surgery for his eyes from the beatings, but couldn't afford it, leaving him dependent on a meager monthly stipend from a political group. Survival came with this crippling, ongoing debt of health and dignity.
And the final, most haunting dimension of this infrastructure of fear is the long shadow of disappearance. Which brings us to Parvina Ahanga.
Yes. Her 16-year-old speech-impaired son, Javed, was taken in 1990 during a routine army raid. Javed never came back.
But Parvina's response wasn't submission. It was organization. She went on to form the Association of Parents of Disappeared Persons, the APDP.
Becoming a mother to them all, helping hundreds of other desperate families strategize, navigate the police and court systems, fight for any information about their lost loved ones.
And the tragedy of the missing is compounded because families often had to hold funerals in absentia, didn't they, when bodies couldn't be recovered from the Lassi region.
They live in this permanent, agonizing state of limbo, constantly watching the news, waiting in grim anxiety every single time an unidentified body is found floating in the Selam River. The absence of a body doesn't grant peace. It grants a permanent wound, a perpetual state of waiting. This deep trauma isn't just individual, it's woven into the collective identity of the valley. Right, the conflict wasn't just about military control. It systematically accelerated these cultural and religious shifts, fundamentally challenging the long-established identity of Kashmiri society. And to really grasp the significance of these shifts, we first have to appreciate the region's historically syncretic past.
Kashmir traditionally had this beautiful, inclusive blend of Hindu, Buddhist, and Islamic traditions. known locally as Kashmiri Sufism or the Rishi order.
Exactly. The source highlights that Nuruddin Rishi, the patron saint of Kashmir, was famously mentored by Laleshwari, a 14th century Brahmin mystic. The idea that a Hindu woman mentored the central figure of Kashmiri Islam that speaks volumes about the historical fusion of faiths.
And even the key conversion story emphasizes this inclusiveness. Rinchana, a 14th century Tibetan prince who ruled Kashmir, was refused conversion by the powerful Brahmin community because of caste restrictions.
Right, so he chose to convert to Islam precisely because, as he noted, it had no caste. This indigenous, inclusive interpretation of Islam, rooted in local traditions, stood in stark opposition to the more puritanical strains that came later.
And this centuries-old tradition faced severe pressure during the conflict from modern revivalist movements. We see these concerted attempts by puritanical Islamist groups, specifically the Salafis and the women's group Dukhtar-e Milat, the Daughters of the Muslim Community, led by Asiya Andrabi, to impose strict Saudi-style Islamic codes.
Yeah, mandating the veil, banning music, discouraging the traditional practice of praying at shrines.
But these attempts at cultural imposition, they often failed miserably, didn't they? Especially in the agrarian heart of society where men and women traditionally worked side by side in fields and orchards.
Right. The puritanical Salafi groups were dismissive of the local shrine-based Sufi traditions and kind of obsessed with superficial details like the right length of a man's beard. Their efforts often alienated the very people they were trying to control.
And the rebellion against this rigidity was fascinatingly expressed through fashion and defiance. The author describes the son of the village Salafi leader, a man raising his kids in this ultra-puritanical way, who, in open rebellion, started coloring his hair different, loud colors every week.
Earning him the wonderful nickname Rainbow.
Rainbow. It demonstrates that the local identity was fighting back against both the military occupation and these internal cultural impositions.
Absolutely. And simultaneously, the society was seeking refuge and maybe embracing modernity through other means. Reduced mobility from constant curfews ironically led to people watching thousands of hours of Hindi films and international news on the newly spread cable TV. Technology provided an escape.
And even new commerce adapted to the fear and lack of privacy. Internet cafes started selling an hour of privacy in these small, hastily built wooden cubicles to young couples for 30 rupees.
Selling a moment of anonymity.
Exactly. Selling a moment of normal human connection in a world where everyone felt constantly watched.
Tragically, though, the conflict also ensured the systematic destruction of physical heritage, accelerating the erasure of that syncretic past. The Islamia College Library, the oldest in Srinagar, burned down in a battle, destroying rare manuscripts, including a 1,400-year-old Quran handwritten by the third Caliph of Islam.
Just gone. 600 years of history vanished when the beloved shrine of Nuruddin Rishi was destroyed in a 1995 gun battle between Indian troops and militants.
And the Pari Mahal, that stunning terraced Mughal pleasure garden, was entirely converted into a paramilitary camp, its domed chambers holding rifles, its historic walls serving as barracks.
Even abandoned religious sites were repurposed for military control. The Raghunath Temple, vacated by the fleeing Pandits, now housed a paramilitary camp, complete with graffiti on a sandbag bunker defiantly reading, "India is great."
What we see here isn't just property destruction, it's a determined erasure of the region's indigenous, complex, syncretic identity, replacing it with the visible monuments of conflict.
So in 1993, the author leaves the escalating danger of the valley and heads to Aligarh Muslim University, AMU, in India. This journey out represented a massive culture shock, not necessarily because of cultural differences, but because of the sheer poverty and pollution he encountered outside the sort of guarded perfection of Kashmir.
Yeah, the author notes this moment of deep discomfort, ethical reflection almost. The reluctance he and his grandfather felt riding in a cycle rickshaw, experiencing the guilt of being pulled by another human being. It was a stark introduction to the wider complexities, the economic disparities of India that the isolated, focused conflict in Kashmir had kind of shielded him from. Furthermore, the world he entered was one witnessing the aggressive rise of Hindu nationalism, particularly after the Babri Masjid demolition.
Right. He arrived just after the mosque's demolition in '92, an event that had triggered widespread religious violence across India. So he found himself in a new kind of hostile environment.
He recounts the absolutely horrifying experience of a Kashmiri friend, Hilal, searched on a train by rioters, checking for circumcision, that brutal mob technique used to identify and target Muslims during riots.
Arthur.
Hilal even witnessed another Kashmiri student pursued by a mob and later found stabbed to death on the railway tracks. For Kashmiri students, leaving the conflict zone only meant entering another area rife with religious and political tension. Yet, despite this insecurity, there was this interesting internal identity conflict among the Kashmiri students at AMU, wasn't there?
Yeah. While most Indian Muslim students were highly patriotic, cheering loudly for the Indian cricket team, the Kashmiri students consistently rooted for Pakistan or Sri Lanka. They maintained their sense of secession, of alienation, even hundreds of miles away.
Years later, the sheer economic devastation of the conflict gives rise to what the author aptly calls the bureaucracy of death.
Right. This concerns the compensatory payment and jobs offered by the state to families who'd lost an innocent person in the conflict. A package often totaling just $100,000, maybe a compensatory job placement.
But the compensation intended as relief or justice instead became another corrosive layer of trauma and corruption.
We have to ask, why did the bureaucracy even need a non-militant certificate in the first place?
Exactly. It was a mechanism designed to ensure the state controlled the narrative of the deceased and, more cynically, to generate revenue through corruption.
The required payment for this certificate was exorbitant relative to the compensation. Applicants had to pay policemen between 5,000 and 10,000 rupees just to get this crucial piece of paper.
And then the file had to move through various corrupt desks. By the time the applicant actually received the relief, they might have lost 30,000 rupees of the 100,000, just bribing clerks and senior officers to make the file move.
The government was essentially commodifying trauma, forcing victims of violence to pay the very system responsible for the conflict just to acknowledge their loss. It's an incredibly potent example of how bureaucracy perpetuates violence in economic terms, not just physical ones.
The author eventually returns in 2001, now a 24-year-old journalist, wanting to be the one to take the stories of Kashmir to the world.
Right.
But the initial euphoria of returning quickly turned to profound sadness and anger after hearing story after story of death and relentless humiliation.
The story of the Crossfire Groom is one of the most agonizing examples he documents. It illustrates how violence targets the most intimate human rituals. Rashid Malik's wedding party attacked by BSF and CRPF forces in 1990. Multiple people killed. His wife, Mubina, shot 3 times and, tragically, raped by soldiers in the mustard fields beside the road.
The physical wounds healed slowly, but the psychological scars remained absolute. Mubina continued to shiver uncontrollably at the mere sight of a uniform years later, a living ghost of that horrific night just clinging to her memory. The wedding, meant to symbolize new life, became the symbol of everything the conflict had destroyed.
It is here, after documenting this unrelenting trauma, that the author has that confrontation that ultimately leads to writing the memoir. His doctor friend, Shahid, confronts him.
Right, recognizing the author's privileged position, you're a privileged minority, you can leave whenever you want.
Shahid challenges him directly, stating that the author, documenting the trauma, is running away every time the stories get too depressing, suggesting a kind of emotional detachment.
He challenged him. Didn't you leave? Then face it. Don't run away every time you hear stories that depress you. It forced the author to confront his own complicity, his distance, recognizing that documenting the truth required not just skill, but emotional endurance, accountability.
When you have hundreds of thousands of soldiers deployed in such a concentrated area, you inevitably start to encounter the humanity beneath the uniform.
You do. The author acknowledges that the soldiers themselves are often the rural and urban poor of India, taking these dangerous, often low-paying jobs out of economic necessity, much like the father had sought a career in the civil service.
But despite that recognition, communication rarely went beyond the formal requirements of conflict. The soldiers, defined by their olive or khaki uniforms, stiff faces, and curt commands, remained strangers.
Yeah, the only words exchanged were those despised litanies of an identity check. Having a real meaningful conversation with a soldier was just unwise, given the consequences if you were overheard.
However, there was this one fleeting, unexpected moment of connection. When a senior paramilitary officer comes to the author's office to investigate a journalist's complaint, he's initially curt, formal.
But over a shared cigarette, the tension just dissolves. The officer relaxes, reveals himself to be a nostalgic Delhi University alumnus. They bond over shared memories of cheap, photocopied books, student hangouts.
For a brief, powerful moment, the conflict just disappears. The uniform, the history, the animosity, all replaced by a common, shared human experience of student life.
But it's temporary, isn't it? A fleeting rupture in the constant reality of conflict. The moment passes, the officer returns to his duty, the journalist to his.
This inherent duality, the constant tension overlaid with this deep, persistent desire for peace. It kind of culminated in 2005 when India and Pakistan opened the peace bus service between Srinagar and Muzaffarabad.
That bus service was a massive, tangible symbol of hope for families separated by decades of conflict.
And this service generated one of the most profoundly moving, just heartbreaking anecdotes in the entire source. Sharif Hussain Bukhari was one of the first to cross the line of control, that heavily militarized border dividing Kashmir, after 58 years of separation. He was in his 60s, returning to the place he was born.
58 years, imagine. At the reception center, a young man rushes toward him, deeply excited. Bukhari looks at him, bewildered. He doesn't recognize the young man at all.
The young man had to introduce himself. I am Shoket, your sister's son.
And Bukhari's reply just encapsulates the entire tragedy of division, the cost of half a century of separation and silence. I'm sorry, son. I didn't even get to see a picture of yours all these years.
The author concludes that the two men's moist eyes, their shared grief and confusion, that was the true, invisible line of control.
Not the geography.
No. That boundary ran not through the mountains, but through the souls, the family structures, the hearts of the Kashmiri people.
Leaving Kashmir once again, the author arrives at this final, heartbreaking realization that perfectly synthesizes the whole journey. The conflict might eventually leave the streets, the monuments, but it might not leave the soul. The personal scars become generational. #outro.
So we've taken this really essential deep dive into a powerful, solitary memoir. We've unpacked the immense duality of Kashmir, that almost fairy tale beauty of its tradition, and the constant, overwhelming, suffocating trauma of militarization. We traced how a political struggle consumed every single aspect of life, from specific fashion trends like those Russian Kamachi shoes and pistol bullet rings,
Yeah, they're big deal.
to sacred historical monuments, and right down to the most intimate personal relationships, forever scarring the innocence of the generation that lived through the 1990s.
The author's grandfather, in his attempt to save his son, once told him, "You don't live long in a war, son." But what this deep dive has definitively shown, I think, is that even if individuals manage to physically survive, like the father escaping that Iago attack because of physics, or the boys surviving torture chambers,
Right. The war ensures that essential parts of life, like innocence, cultural heritage, personal ambition, they are permanent, long-term casualties. So we leave you with this final, necessary question for reflection. A question that connects the physical pain back to that systemic corruption we talked about.
Okay.
We saw how families who lost children often received compensation that was immediately eaten up by administrative fees and bribes. Considering the intense systemic trauma inflicted by detention centers like Papa 2, the routine humiliation of crackdowns, the constant crushing fear of disappearance, what is the ultimate moral and economic cost of maintaining such a bureaucracy of violence? Is survival itself in this context simply a prolonged, uncompensated form of ongoing trauma?